Good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin today's discussions, I just wanted to draw your attention. I'm sure most of you do not need reminding that this is our last class meeting for the semester. I'm sure many of you are happy about that. Hopefully not because of me, but I'm somewhat happy about it too. Not that I didn't enjoy teaching this class, but it's always nice to look forward to some time off. The first thing I wanted to briefly talk about is, of course, something that's likely to be on your mind, which is the final exam for this course. The final exam, you should check the final exam schedule to make sure you get the date and the location correct. And make sure that you double check that a couple of days beforehand because sometimes things get shifted around to make sure that you're in the right place. Basically, all I need to say about the midterm test is that it's going to be very, very similar, the final exam, is that it's going to be very similar to the midterm test. In other words, it will consist of an identification section and of an essay section. And the identification section, like last time, will have a number of terms which you are expected to provide a brief explanation of their meaning and their significance to understanding global politics. As you did on the midterm, you will have some choice on that, on which of those to answer. So if you're stumped by one or two of the terms, that will hopefully not throw you off too far. Yeah.
On the midterm, we just had an exam. We didn't have an IELTS.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm getting confused. I teach 5 different classes, and they do have slightly different structures. You're quite correct. I take that back. There is no identification section. My apologies. There's only 3 essays of which you are expected to answer 2. Sorry for my confusion, and thanks for bringing that up. There's 3 essay questions of which you are expected to answer 2. The nature of those essay questions will be similar to the ones that you confronted on the midterm. They'll be relatively broad and ask you to engage in the main themes which we've covered over the course. The focus of those questions will be on material that we've covered since the midterm. In other words, you do not need to study all the material prior to the midterm, but I would suggest that you briefly review that material insofar as that the discussions of, in particular, the emergence of the international system, of the different approaches to understanding international relations, and the impact and continuing legacy of the Cold War certainly are relevant to some of the themes that we've covered since that time. And you might want to include those to some extent in your discussions in answering those essay questions. If you did okay in the midterm, then for the most part, I would say that you should just follow the same thing that worked for you in the midterm. The unfortunate thing, of course, with regard to any kind of test, and less so with essay tests than any other form of testing, is that it tests your ability to take tests just as much as it tests your understanding of the material that's actually being tested. That basically means that there's a few things that you could do in order to avoid losing points unnecessarily due to miscalculations and things along those lines in terms of how you approach the test. The first thing that I would recommend in that regard that you be very careful about is make sure that you budget your time carefully. You'll be expected to answer 2 questions. You'll have an hour for each of them. The exam will be 2 hours long. Make sure that you budget your time carefully within that so that you don't run out of time, so you don't spend too much time on one essay and write a brilliant essay on that one and then lose a lot of points on the other one because you didn't have enough time. That's a frequent mistake, but an unnecessary mistake. So make sure that you don't fall into that trap. The other thing that's important to keep in mind is that it's not quantity that counts. In terms of, I wish it were. It would make our job in grading it a heck of a lot easier. All we have to do is see who has the longest answer, and they get A's, and people that have short answers get lesser grades. But it doesn't work that way. Quality is much more important than quantity. So it is important that you spend a minute or 2 to think about the questions and to think about what is relevant to the question, what you might want to include in your discussion. It's also worth it in that regard to draw yourself a very brief outline. In other words, spend 5 minutes on each of those questions, just thinking about the question and putting together a brief outline of what you think you should include in the discussion, and then as you write the essay, follow that with a brief outline. For the most part, those that do so tend to get much better grades than those that simply start writing right away and consequently don't organize their answer as effectively as it could otherwise be organized. Other than that, there's not a heck of a lot of advice that I can give you other than that one of the reasons that I recall as an undergraduate way before World War II, I quite enjoy taking tests is not that I really enjoy taking tests, but that in comparison to having to write research papers and things along those lines, tests had the great advantage of being over within 2 hours. And that meant that as long as you could keep it together for those 2 hours and perform well during those 2 hours, you got as much credit as you deserved. The other thing that made that component of my evaluation easier for me is the rather correct assumption that in any kind of an exam, close to half of the class are so freaked out by the time they walk into the exam room that they can barely put a coherent sentence together. And that means if you just keep a cool head and provide a clear answer, you're already way ahead of the pack. Now, I'm not suggesting that most of you are going to freak out before you walk into the exam room, but I certainly suggest that you do your best to avoid that. And one way of avoiding that is try to avoid studying on the day of the test. The reason that I suggest that is because if you haven't gotten a handle on the material that we've covered over the last several months by the day of the exam, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a handle on it in the last 2 hours before the test. And if you study on the day of the test, the natural tendency, one that's rather hard to avoid, is to gravitate toward the material that you feel least comfortable with. And as you gravitate toward that material that you feel least comfortable with, you'll get less and less comfortable with it because you're not likely to get a clear understanding of that in the last couple of hours. And that in turn means that by the time that you walk into the exam, you're going to be very nervous, and that never helps. So on the day before the exam, at 8 o'clock at night, put your books away, go and have a beer maybe, just one, and only if you're of age. And then get a good night's sleep and put things aside and make sure that you have a clear head by the time you walk into the exam room. Having said all of that, let me make some concluding comments, and I will try to keep it down to a minimum today. I know I've promised that in the past and not made good on that promise, but I'll do my best to leave as much time at the end of the class today for any questions that you may have on any of the topics that we've touched on so far. I think one good way of summarizing or ending a class like this is to look at some of the key questions that face those that are analyzing international relations, like yourselves. And consequently, I'm going to look at 4 core questions that I think are very much important in trying to understand the future of the international system and the relevance of much of what we've studied over the last term. One of the first important questions is the spread of weapons of mass destruction. Can and should the spread of weapons of mass destruction be stopped? And that's a core question in international relations, in large part because, as we just studied in looking at the emergence of the state system, and in particular that section on 500 years of history in 2 hours, where we looked at the transformations of the nature of war. One thing that distinguishes the 20th century and is likely to distinguish the 21st century from previous eras of conflict, of international conflict, are the nature of the weapons that are used in those conflicts. And weapons of mass destruction in that regard are an extremely important component of that. As we noted in our discussions, in wars prior to the 20th century, and indeed including World War I, 9 out of 10 combatants that died in wars were generally, 9 out of 10 casualties of war were legitimate combatants. In other words, were soldiers in uniform. By the Second World War, that statistic changed to 60% of those killed in the war were civilians. Only 40% were soldiers in uniform. In the subsequent wars, it has come close to a 90% civilian casualty rate. And much of that has to do with the nature of weapons, which have become more and more indiscriminate and more destructive. And certainly, therefore, we should think carefully about the impact of these weapons of mass destruction, the most severe of which are, of course, nuclear weapons. And the future of humanity, the future of the international system, depends to a considerable extent on decisions made regarding weapons of mass destruction. But, as is the case with virtually every other field of the social sciences, including political science and international relations, there is no clear consensus about what to do about weapons of mass destruction. There is a general consensus that certain types of indiscriminate weapons, like landmines, like cluster munitions, and so on and so forth, should be eliminated because they don't serve an important function in wars, and because they are, by their very nature, indiscriminate. They, by their very nature, have a tendency to kill people other than their intended targets, including civilians. But with the more important weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons, there is less of a consensus whether the impact of nuclear weapons is positive or is negative. And you might think that it's hard to argue that the presence of nuclear weapons is a positive development. Nuclear weapons are probably the most immediate threat to our survival on this planet. Long before climate change is likely to make itself felt, we could wipe each other out using nuclear weapons simply by a miscalculation between the United States and Russia, or the United States and China, that causes them to send their missiles flying. In that regard, they certainly pose an enormous threat to humanity. On the other hand, many international relations theorists have argued that the reason why the Cold War remained cold, at least in relationship to the Soviet Union and the United States and its immediate allies, did not result in a hot war and an exchange of missiles, was precisely because of the enormous destructiveness of nuclear weapons. In other words, what was possible in all eras prior to World War II and including World War II, which is that leaders engaged in warfare, in large part by deluding themselves about the prospects of those wars, about their likelihood of being able to be victorious in those wars, and the likelihood that they would make major gains in terms of their power and security by being victorious in those wars, is unthinkable in the context of nuclear weapons. Nobody can win a nuclear war, certainly not one between the United States and a power like Russia. Essentially, a war that involves the exchange of the nuclear arsenals of those two powers would wipe out all of humanity, and certainly wipe out the United States and Russia. In that regard, the ability to judge what is rational is much more feasible with the existence of nuclear weapons than it is in the absence of nuclear weapons. And consequently, there's also a considerable amount of disagreement as to how important it is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Of course, since the passage of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the consensus internationally has been that we should try to keep nuclear weapons in as few hands as possible, and in fact should try to encourage those that already have nuclear weapons to get rid of them. Indeed, that was the nature of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is that it encouraged all countries on the planet that did not have nuclear weapons to sign onto the treaty, and for doing so they would be rewarded by getting help from the existing nuclear powers in developing civilian nuclear technologies. And it also committed those that already had nuclear weapons to do their best to eliminate their own stockpiles and to eliminate nuclear weapons from the international system as a whole. In that regard, it's interesting to note that North Korea, which has recently developed nuclear weapons, did initially sign onto the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but withdrew from it in the 1990s, and in that sense is not doing anything technically illegal in developing nuclear weapons today. Iran did sign onto the Non-Proliferation Treaty and has consistently argued that it has kept within the bounds of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and is developing nuclear technologies only as its basic right as guaranteed as a signatory of that treaty. Of course, many suspect that the Iranians may be cheating in this regard. Why is Iran a particular problem? Why is North Korea a particular problem? In part by virtue of the fact that many perceive them as rogue states. In other words, unlike other responsible states, rational states in the international system. North Korea is often judged by those outside of North Korea as being governed in accordance to the whims of its rather, well, from outside eyes at least, somewhat bizarre leader, who cannot be trusted to be rational in his calculations. Likewise, with regard to Iran, many have argued that Iran is not a democracy, is not a modern state in the way that most other states in the international system are, but is instead a theocracy. And that a theocracy, by its very nature, is not a rational form of government. It is based on religious belief, not on scientific rationality and things along those lines. And that religious belief could include a belief in martyrdom or something along those lines. In other words, that the Iranian leadership might be willing to martyr themselves as well as their country in the hope of guaranteed rewards in paradise or something along those lines. And therefore, that it's much more problematic for them to have nuclear weapons than for other states. Again, I say that not because I believe it, but rather because it's something that is often argued, especially on Fox News and places like that. Overwhelmingly, the realists, or realists in particular, the most vocal writer in that tradition is Stephen Walt, have argued that this is not the case. Stephen Walt has argued that states inherently are rational, not by virtue of the fact that all the people that make up that state, including their leaders, are rational. Indeed, realists and many risk analysts and so on and so forth have long rejected the idea that humans are fundamentally rational. Humans are not fundamentally rational. They are as much governed by emotion as they are by rationality. In fact, much more by emotion than by rationality. Humans are not rational, but institutions can be. And states are forced to be rational, not by virtue of the fact that they're made up of rational people, but by virtue of the fact that they are in an environment, or they operate in an environment where they have no choice but to be rational in order to defend themselves against external chaos. And from that point of view, I have not seen any real evidence that either the leadership in North Korea or the leadership in Iran are suicidal. And for either power to develop nuclear weapons and actually use them would require that they are suicidal, because the consequence of those actions are very predictable. They would immediately lead to this destruction of themselves and their entire states in the retaliatory strikes against them. In that regard, many realists argue that the spread of nuclear weapons may not be much of a problem. Stephen Walt goes a step further and argues that in many ways it might be a good idea to spread nuclear weapons further. Because, essentially, nuclear weapons, just as they did in the context of the Cold War, make war less likely, not more likely. Because they make the outcome of wars immediately predictable. In that regard, he would argue that Pakistan and India, two nuclear rivals and neighbors, are far less likely to go to war against each other in the context of both powers having nuclear weapons than they were previously. Where both sides can convince themselves that they could make tactical gains and so on by engaging in conflict. Pakistan and India, in that regard, are likely to follow the same pattern that the United States and the Soviet Union followed during the Cold War. And the main concerns of the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War were, above all else, to avoid a direct conflict. That doesn't mean there weren't conflicts. There were conflicts on the periphery, but in each of those cases, the superpowers, for the most part, try to contain those conflicts, try to prevent those conflicts from escalating into wider regional conflicts, and from there escalating into nuclear confrontations between the superpowers. And of course, they were relatively successful in doing so. So, should we all leave this classroom by saying, yay, nuclear weapons, let's get more of them, get Canada to get nuclear weapons? Well, I wouldn't go that far. And one reason that I wouldn't go that far is that I think there are very important arguments against that notion of nuclear security. And those are generally produced in part by liberal political theorists, but more importantly, by people that come out of a completely different tradition. Among the most important thinkers in that tradition would be people like Charles Perrow, who comes out of the field of engineering and who studies complex systems. And one of the things that he highlights is that complex systems by which he means things like nuclear reactors, military technologies, civilian airliners, and so on and so forth, are so complex that they become unpredictable. And consequently, in his groundbreaking book, Normal Accidents, he argues that the adoption of these kinds of technologies inherently has to accept that accidents will happen. Accidents will happen because these technologies are so complex and so tightly coupled, meaning they depend on everything functioning in perfect harmony, that miscalculations are virtually inevitable. To put that into the context of international relations, the closest that the Soviet Union and the United States ever got to nuclear war was, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But they came just as close on a number of occasions simply by miscalculation, by some sensor firing off a warning that a missile had been launched by the Soviet Union that later turned out to not to be a missile. And that happened in both directions. The United States on a number of occasions had false alarms that resulted from flocks of geese or something along those lines being mistaken for missiles, and the Russians had similar experiences. Now, the Soviet Union and the United States managed to avoid acting on those false alarms and launching their own missiles in retaliation without real justification. But can we guarantee that these kinds of miscalculations would not occur in other parts of the world, especially as more and more countries obtain nuclear weapons? Are the technologies involved in trying to gauge or trying to warn about an incoming missile strike as well developed in Pakistan and India? And could they misfire and result in a nuclear exchange in that context? Well, obviously those chances are far greater the more we have nuclear powers. Another major component that we should very much be thinking about in this context is non-state actors. Non-state actors. One of the key aspects of the secure interpretation of nuclear weapons by realists is the idea that states are rational actors. However, non-state actors are not. Why are states rational actors? Essentially because they have a defined territory, they have a government that controls the monopoly of legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence, and so on and so forth, and because they need to protect that territory, that population, and themselves. And consequently, they know that if they launch a nuclear strike against one of their adversaries, they're likely to be retaliated against. In other words, that their adversaries in all likelihood have deterrent capacity. And thus, a nuclear strike becomes irrational. But you cannot deter terrorists. Terrorists are not tied down to a particular territory, to a particular location. And terrorists, much more than states, can consist of irrational actors who are likely to martyr themselves, as we've seen repeatedly in suicide bombings around the world and so on. In other words, the more nuclear powers they are, the more likely that some of those nuclear weapons are likely to fall into the hands of non-state actors like terrorist networks. And that would indeed be very alarming. Again, realists, for the most part, tend to play down the risk of such an event. Essentially, Stephen Wald, in response to these kinds of claims, argues that states have to devote enormous resources in order to produce nuclear weapons. And given the enormous resources that they devote to doing so, scientific, technological, and so on and so forth, they're very unlikely to hand over those nuclear weapons once they've developed them to a non-state actor that they cannot directly control. And that could, in turn, provide or result in a major retaliation against them. In other words, if Iran, for example, were to be successful in producing a bomb and hand that bomb off to Hamas or Hezbollah or something along those lines, and such a bomb was exploded in Israel or in Europe or in North America, it would be relatively easy on the basis of the isotopes and so on involved to trace that bomb back to Iran. And consequently, the international community would almost certainly take retaliatory action against Iran. Would Iran be likely to accept that kind of risk in handing off their nuclear weapons to an actor that they don't directly control? Well, most realists argue that's pretty unlikely. nuclear states, once they've obtained nuclear weapons, will guard those at all expense in order to prevent them from being seized by other powers or by non-state actors. That doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility, however, of terrorist networks gaining access to nuclear materials. Indeed, Mr. Obama is hosting a conference in Washington next week, at which the Chinese president will also be present, essentially dealing with trying to secure nuclear materials. Nuclear materials lend themselves to some extent to the building of nuclear weapons. However, an atomic bomb and a hydrogen bomb are enormously complex technologies that are beyond the reach of most terrorist networks to produce on their own. But nuclear material can also be used in what is often referred to as a dirty bomb. In other words, you just put a bunch of radioactive material into a suitcase and put a bunch of dynamite in with it, and the explosion will spread that nuclear material over a large area, and by doing so contaminate that entire area for decades, if not centuries to come. And as such, could be a very potent terrorist weapon, even if it doesn't rise to the level of destruction of a conventional atomic bomb or an H-bomb. In that regard, again, there are considerable worries involved. The last point that I would make is that while states like the United States and like the Soviet Union and most of the other currently nuclear powers are relatively well-developed states and relatively stable and do fit the description of rational actors in the sense that the government controls a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, coercion, and violence, that cannot be said of all states in the international system. And one argument, one very potent argument against the spread of nuclear weapons, against Stephen Walt's argument in particular, is the case of Pakistan. Pakistan is a state that, by many measures, could be considered a failed state. It does not control all of its territory, and there are strong signs that the elected government at this point of Nawaz Sharif does not have full control over all aspects of state power. In other words, that he does not fully control the armed forces, and that he does not fully control the intelligence agencies. And this is a state or this is a situation that has persisted in Pakistan for some time, and was made evident during what became known as the Kargil crisis. The Kargil crisis involved Pakistani military personnel crossing the line of demarcation in Kashmir, in other words, the division of Kashmir between India and Pakistan, into the Indian-controlled side without authorization, technically a kind of a small-scale invasion, which created an immediate crisis in which the Indian state immediately retaliated and a brief war erupted. And in which apparently the Pakistanis, in large part because the Indian state enjoys considerable advantages in conventional military capacities, mobilized its nuclear forces. And mobilized its nuclear forces apparently without the knowledge of the then sitting president in Pakistan, who happened to also be Nawaz Sharif at that time. Again, that kind of unauthorized release of nuclear weapons is always a possibility, especially in states that are less well established than those like the United States and the Soviet Union. So let me leave weapons of mass destruction at that for the moment and turn to another component of the international system that we should wonder about and that hopefully you're interested in trying to understand. And that is that in our discussions of the emergence of the international system as it exists today, we noted that the international system has been transformed from one in which there were a multiplicity of different wielders of force, in other words, a multipolar international order, to one in which fewer and fewer states became dominant. So that by the beginning of World War II, essentially we had the multipolar order that maintained relative order during the 19th century in Europe, devolved into a bipolar order, meaning essentially two alliances facing against each other. And from there, Essentially, we moved through the Cold War, which was a bipolar order in a different manner, confronting or pitting the Soviet Union and its allies against the United States and its allies, to essentially a unipolar system that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Unipolar in that the remaining superpower, the United States, was so much more powerful than any of the other countries in the international system that it became the dominant actor, the hegemon, if you like, globally. And we certainly would want to know whether this is a stable situation or whether this is something that is likely to break down. And again, on that question, there are differences of opinion, with some arguing that this unipolar moment is likely to persist for quite some time. In other words, that the United States is likely to remain dominant for at least the rest of this century. And others arguing quite to the contrary, that the United States is a paper tiger at this point and is about to lose its status as the dominant player in the international system. So which is it? Well, from a theoretical perspective, in particular realists tend to argue that unipolarity, by its very nature, is at best a temporary situation and cannot last. Why? Well, essentially, realists argue that the rise of a unipolar dominant power internationally brings about various kinds of reactions among the lesser powers in the international system. On the one hand, it will lead to what they refer to as bandwagoning. And by bandwagoning, what is meant is that given the enormous power of the United States, more countries in the international system will see their best strategy for maintaining their security as being to endear themselves as much as possible to the United States. In other words, to cooperate as much as possible with the US government. On the other hand, there will be another strategy, and that is to start to counterbalance against the United States. And the counterbalancing, realists argue, is ultimately likely to become dominant. And one reason for that is the old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And therefore, a power like the United States, being as unchallenged in the international system, is likely to act in a manner that is not going to be viewed as legitimate by large portions of the planet. In other words, an extremely powerful state like the United States is going to expect that most conflicts that it is involved with other countries are settled in favor of its interests, and is going to act accordingly. And as it does so, it's going to create resentment among other states that increasingly feel like they're being excluded from fair participation in the system dominated by the United States. And that, in turn, will lead to a tendency to counterbalance against that unipolar dominant state. Essentially, realists argue that this is almost inevitable, that states inherently, as they become more powerful, become more arrogant, and come to expect that they can impose solutions that fit their own interests. And this is not simply because of the lack of wisdom of late leaders, but in part also because those leaders are answerable to their publics. And their publics are going to say, well, why did you sign that deal? We're already seeing that with the elections in the United States and the deal that Mr. Obama reached with Iran. Donald, the deal maker, said, this is a lousy deal. We could have gotten a much better deal. And again, that signifies not only the arrogance of Donald Trump, which is beyond question, but the growing arrogance of a state whose public and whose government increasingly expects these kinds of issues to be settled in their favor. And the more that is the case, the more other countries will start to chafe against it. And we're seeing that in the current context as well, in large part because of the expectation that the United States will continue to dominate in the United Nations, in the major financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. Countries that feel disadvantaged by that are starting to develop means of trying to counterbalance against it. And the most important developments in that regard are, on the one hand, or most importantly, the BRICS organization. In other words, the coalition between Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, in coordinating their policies and in trying to form another order, another economic order, including trying to bypass the US dollar as the dominant currency involved in trade, and trading at least between themselves using their domestic currencies, and also creating other financial institutions to challenge the dominance of the World Bank. Another similar organization that has arisen in Eurasia is the Shanghai Cooperation Council countries that consist of Russia and China and some of the Central Asian countries, and so on. These moves are quite clearly an indication that countries that are perceived as hostile to American interests and that the United States treats accordingly are starting to counterbalance against the United States and are clearly starting to resent the dominance of the US. And China has taken some major steps in that, including the establishment last year of the Asian International Development Bank, a direct challenge to the dominance of the World Bank in financing infrastructure projects and so on and so forth. Another component of that question of unipolarity has to do with what is often referred to as hegemonic stability theory. Hegemonic stability theory, as we discussed previously, essentially grows out of realism and argues that in relation to trade, that free trade regimes have existed in the past, but when they have existed, they have always been dependent on the ability of one hegemonic power to create order that facilitates that trade. And in that regard, global free trade and something akin to globalization occurred during the 19th century. During the 19th century, trade was largely liberalized and largely free between various European powers and much of the rest of the world, but it depended on institutions that were created by Great Britain and were maintained by Great Britain. And were thus, in effect, as long as Great Britain remained the dominant hegemonic power on the global stage. However, that imposed costs on Great Britain that the other countries in the international system, that its competitors, did not have to bear. In particular, France, Germany, the United States, Japan, and so on, all those late industrializing countries trying to catch up with Great Britain, did not need to bear those costs, and consequently started to grow, and started to grow more rapidly than Great Britain did, ultimately eclipsing Great Britain as a dominant economic power. And once that started to occur, essentially what realists tend to emphasize is that states will focus on not just their absolute gains, in other words, that free trade will lift all boats, that everyone benefits from free trade, but will start to focus on relative gains. The fact that they may be gaining from that free trade arrangement. The United States can still consider itself to be making major advances as a result of the open trade system that it created, but other players in the international system are gaining more than they are, and therefore will in the long term be able to eclipse their power. And that situation certainly seems to be the case with regard to China. The United States is still the largest economy on the planet, still by a long, long shot the biggest military force on the planet, but the Chinese are slowly catching up. If they have not already surpassed the United States in terms of their GDP, they are likely to do so within the next 5 or 10 years for certain. And as their GDP increases, so does their military spending. And as their military spending increases, their ability to challenge the United States in various parts of the world, like the South China Sea, also increases. And consequently, the dominance of one power will lead to the rise of other powers and the eventual decline of that dominant power, which becomes overextended in maintaining its military, has to neglect its domestic economy and its domestic infrastructure in order to maintain its international commitments, and consequently becomes hollowed out in the same way that Great Britain kind of became hollowed out at the end of the 19th century. In other words, the US may be in decline, and that will lead to a renewal of a multipolar order, which many see as, on the whole, positive, in that it reins in the superpower that may be inclined to act unilaterally, but is also more likely to produce conflicts, as has happened in multipolar systems previously. Is the United States in decline? Well, there are certainly strong indications that it is. It is currently the biggest debtor country on the planet, no longer the biggest creditor. Its infrastructure is starting to fall apart, as nicely demonstrated by the events in Flint, Michigan, where the population has been poisoned by their drinking water, in large part because the state couldn't afford to upgrade their drinking water system and decided to make use of polluted river sources for drinking water. In that sense, there are strong signs that the United States might be in economic decline. Militarily, it is still likely to be dominant. Now, does that mean that China and India are about to bypass the United States and become dominant powers? Well, at least some authors argue that that's still very far-fetched. Joseph Nye probably is the most articulate in that tradition, who's argued that certainly the United States has growing problems that are becoming very, very obvious. But if you look at anything but the GDP numbers, you'll also notice that China has far, far greater problems. Certainly, the size of its economy is close to, if not as big as the United States, but it has a population of well over around 1.5 billion people. The United States has a population of only about 330 million people. And that means that the per capita GDP in China is still on the level of developing countries, and certainly not at the level of highly industrialized countries like those of Western Europe and North America. It has a long ways to go. And given that persisting poverty, which in particular is located or is concentrated in the western regions of China, it has enormous problems with maintaining its own stability. And in that regard, the rise of China or the ability of China to eclipse the United States as a dominant power is very much in question. The other problem with regard to China is that while it is growing extremely rapidly, many, and most vocally Edward Luttwak, have suggested that the best way to look at this situation in China currently is to compare it to the situation of Germany at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century, Germany was in a very similar position to China currently. It was growing much more rapidly than any of the other economies in the international system, certainly than any of the other economies in Europe. It had bypassed Britain as the dominant industrial producer, had become the most efficient producer of things like chemicals and electronic goods and various other forms of machinery, its auto industry and so on and so forth. And consequently, if you'd asked people in 1900 which country is going to dominate all of Europe by 1920, pretty much anyone with a brain would have said Germany. But we all know that by 1920, Germany was in tatters. In other words, it had completely fallen apart. And why? In large part because the rapid growth of Germany and the rapid growth that went with Germany's economic expansion in its military capacities created what in international relations circles is usually referred to as a security dilemma. In other words, Germany, concerned with its security and therefore industrializing and militarizing to protect its security, became more secure. But as it became more secure, its neighbors became less secure. And that dynamic ultimately resulted in the countries of France, Russia, and Great Britain forming an alliance against Germany. And no matter how powerful Germany had become, once that alliance took shape, essentially Germany's goose was cooked. Basically, it could not win a conflict against those three powers on two different sides of its own territory. And the loss of the First World War essentially meant that Germany was destroyed for all intents and purposes. The Second World War was to a large extent a repeat of the First World War in that regard. China, in that sense, faces similar kinds of problems. As it becomes more powerful, its neighbors become more worried. And we're already seeing that, in particular in the South China Sea, where the Chinese are increasingly expecting conflicts over territory in the South China Sea to be settled in their own favor. And that in turn threatens the interests of Vietnam, of the Philippines, of Taiwan, of Japan, and South Korea. And consequently has resulted in each of those countries drawing closer to the superpower that guarantees their security, in other words, the United States. The United States was losing ground in Asia consistently from the 1990s onward. The Philippines in the early 1990s threw all of the American military bases off of its territory. Well, a couple of years ago, they invited them back. And the reason they invited them back isn't because they suddenly fell in love with the United States or because they liked Obama better than Bush or something along those lines. The reasons why they invited them back is because of their growing fear that they could not maintain their claims to various island groups in the South China Sea in the absence of American support. And in that regard, it was the fear of China that pushed them into the arms of the United States. And China has various kinds of conflicts of that sort with all of its neighbors, including India, with which it has territorial disputes in Ladakh and in Arunachal Pradesh, Japan, in which it has conflicting claims with regard to island groups, and so on and so forth. And consequently, the rapid rise of China might produce the same kind of outcome in the context of China that we saw in Germany. Are there other challengers to this unipolarity? Well, Russia is often mentioned as such, but all indications are that Russia is a declining power, not a rising power. And as a declining power, is certainly very paranoid about the intentions of its neighbors and the intentions of the great powers in the international system, and therefore acts accordingly. And acts accordingly both in terms of reacting to the events in Ukraine, where that threatened its access to a very important naval base, the only naval base on the Caspian, on the Black Sea, that gives it access to the Mediterranean and so on and so forth, which is located in Crimea, which was technically part of Ukraine. But the Ukraine, when it gained its independence, signed an agreement with Russia that it would allow Russia to maintain its naval base there. Well, the new government that came to power as a result of the coup in 2013 in Ukraine showed all signs of trying to renege on that. And consequently, Russia, being rather paranoid, certainly took advantage of that situation to reclaim Crimea. In the West, that was often interpreted as the first step toward trying to reestablish the Soviet Union, to recapture all of Ukraine, and then Georgia, and then Moldova, and so on and so forth. But most, well, again, there are differences of opinions, but in my opinion, my humble opinion, if you look at the actual facts, what they seem to indicate is that Russia is in no position to reclaim authority over additional territory. Essentially, its population is declining, its economy is in steep decline, and so on. At best, it can maintain its current status and is doing its best to do so. And therefore, its adventure in Ukraine should be seen as defensive, not offensive. And indeed, its intervention in Syria, I think, is more motivated, again, by holding onto a couple of military bases that it has in Syria, and by the concern that it countered the perception of being a weak player. In other words, probably the biggest interest that Russia had in intervening in Syria is to demonstrate that it still has considerable military capacities, and that is not simply a power without the ability to protect itself and ripe for the picking by Western countries. That may also be why they pulled out so quickly. They demonstrated their military capacities, including their possession of cruise missiles and things along those lines, and that was really all they wanted to achieve, and to give their ally of Assad a bit of a boost. The strategy of the superpower in this situation, and the declared strategy of the superpower, the United States, is that it will do whatever is necessary to prevent any challenges to its dominance in the international system. And that takes a number of different forms. First and foremost, the strategy of containment with regard to those countries that could threaten to challenge the United States. And that is most evident in regard to the US's attitude toward China. Everything points to that the Trans-Pacific Partnership being negotiated currently by the United States and various other players in the Asia Pacific is geared toward containing China. It includes all of the China's neighbors, but not China itself. And in that sense, cuts China off from its East Asian markets, as well as making it more difficult to access the American market. Something similar is developing in regard to Western Europe, where a similar kind of a free trade, Atlantic free trade agreement is being negotiated, essentially to cut Europe off from the rest of the Eurasian continent, in particular Russia and China. In that regard, it is again a part of that containment strategy. It could also be seen as part of an encirclement strategy. Another component of the strategy of the U.S. Was the enunciation of what became known as the Bush Doctrine. And the Bush Doctrine was unique in that Mr. Bush argued that the United States considered itself authorized or legitimate in attacking countries that may not be a threat to its security currently, but could in the future become a threat to its security. In other words, preventive war. And it was, of course, applied to Iraq, and the United States had no problems taking down Iraq in that regard, the chaos that ensued subsequently notwithstanding. But preventive war could be applied in any kind of a context to a country that might, in the future, become a problem for the United States. And China would certainly be at the top of that list. And again, if the United States perceived China as a challenger to its dominance, and as a rapidly rising power, it has every motivation to take advantage of its current superiority in military force, rather than putting off that kind of a confrontation until China becomes more powerful, and thus the conflict would become much more costly for the United States. So that is indeed a somewhat worrisome prospect. Is the United States about to make war on China? I won't go that far, and one reason for that is that the United States has been pursuing two different tracks of policies toward China. On the one hand, it has been pursuing, or has had the attitude toward China of it being a possible threat to its security in the long term, and therefore containing it as best as possible. On the other hand, it has seen China as an enormous opportunity for expanding its own trade and its own economic ties. And that has led to a situation where the two countries are currently military rivals, but at the same time are very much interdependent on each other. The Chinese need access to the American market for their products. The Americans need access to the Chinese market for investment, for selling their products, and also need access to Chinese funds in order to maintain or to compensate for their balance of payments deficits. In that regard, essentially, as one analyst put it, the United States and China are Siamese twins attached at the wallet. Basically, neither of them like each other particularly, but they are both dependent on each other, and dependent on each other in very important ways, including militarily. Meaning that the Chinese have absolutely no interest in pushing the United States out of the Pacific or out of the South China Sea. Because the first thing that would happen if the United States withdrew its forces from the Western Pacific and the South China Sea is that China's neighbors would feel all the more insecure. In particular, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And what might Japan and South Korea and Taiwan do if they felt less secure? Make a military alliance, certainly, but more importantly, all three of them could produce nuclear weapons more or less overnight. They have the technological capacity to do so, and would almost certainly do so as a deterrent against the overwhelming military superiority of China as a deterrent weapon. And there's nothing that indicates that China would be interested in that kind of an outcome. In that sense, things are likely to remain somewhat more stable, and those countries are likely to increasingly muddle through whatever conflicts arise. Let me briefly talk about globalization as another one of these key questions. We talked extensively about the nature of globalization. What I want to talk about very briefly now is the future of globalization. Again, as we indicated, globalization, many realists argue, is a temporary phenomenon, that things like globalization have occurred in the past and have diminished in the past. Free trade reached equally high levels at the end of the 19th century as currently, but then countries returned to more nationalist policies and more aggressive military strategies and so on that ended that globalization period during the 19th century. As we discussed in our lecture a couple of weeks ago, the kind of globalization that is taking place today is a lot more than simply free trade. It has a great deal to do with the growing mobility of capital and of finance, and in particular, with the growing mobility of information that allows corporations indeed to rationalize their operations on a global level, spreading different components of their production processes into different parts of the world in accordance to where they can make the greatest profits. In that sense, it is somewhat different. However, is it likely to continue? And in that regard, there are some important questions. One of which is that in the developed world itself, globalization since the 1990s, and arguably even before then, has resulted in a pattern of growing income inequality. In other words, as Occupy Wall Street made us aware, the growing rift between the 1% and the 99%. If they'd been a little bit more accurate, they would have pointed out that the rift is really between the 0.1% and the 99.9%, because it is really a very tiny sliver at the very top of American society that has become enormously wealthy, the billionaire class, mostly at the expense of everyone else. And the problem with inequality is that it tends to destabilize countries. In other words, it tends to bring about or exacerbate what Marxists might call class conflict. And we're already starting to see the evidence of that in the United States and elsewhere. In the United States, in the success that populist movements are having in the US. And by populist movements, I mean movements that appeal to the lower classes, those that feel themselves to be excluded by the economic model imposed upon them. And they have, on the one hand, supported the candidacy of Donald Trump, and on the other hand, supported the candidacy of Sanders. Similar things are happening elsewhere, in particular in Western Europe. The UK has undergone an enormous transformation in the last year, in particular in regard to its natural governing party, which was the Labour Party. The Labour Party, over the last several decades, has moved more and more to the center, more and more to the right. And in particular, under Tony Blair, essentially became more or less indistinguishable from their conservative counterparts, basically arguing for the same set of economic policies, imposing austerity, and so on and so forth. Given that, the Labour Party lost a great deal of its support. It lost a great deal of its support to Scottish nationalists that increasingly felt that the policies in London no longer reflected their preferences, and thus Labour lost all of its seats to the Scottish Nationalist Party in the recent elections. And in the last elections, or the last leadership selection of the Labour Party, somebody very similar to Sanders emerged as the leader of Labour, Jeremy Corbyn. Who is very similar to Sanders in that he is pretty far to the left of the Labour spectrum, was openly opposed by everyone of the more prominent Labour leaders, including Tony Blair, but won the nomination nonetheless. And that indicates that there's considerable discontent in Great Britain. And Great Britain is by no means the only country in the Western world in which that kind of discontent is becoming manifest. Among the more prominent examples are the situations in particular in Spain and Greece. Again, the European Union has increasingly concentrated wealth and power in the hands of the few at the expense of the many. And that is being felt most extremely in the countries that were already relatively less advantaged in the European Union, such as Greece and Spain. And the imposition of austerity policies throughout the European community, or the European Union, including in places like Greece and Spain, are creating considerable instability. And that instability might manifest itself in bringing to power governments hostile to free trade and pursuing more nationalist economic policies. Or it could result in the destabilization of these states, and certainly in the destabilization of the European Union. In that sense, it's pretty problematic. The same thing is to a large extent true in the developing world. In particular in India and China, the rapid growth, economic growth in both India and China has not been evenly distributed across all population groups, meaning that there are minorities, in particular in India, that have become fabulously wealthy, While the vast majority of the population remains in poverty, India has more of its citizens living in absolute poverty, which is defined by the UN as an income of less than $370 per year, in other words, less than $1 a day, than all of sub-Saharan Africa combined. And we don't hear much about that, in large part because we hear a lot about the great successes of India, and they are tremendous successes in developing a software industry, in attracting foreign investment, and so on and so forth. But all of that integration into the world economy has produced some very few winners and a great deal of losers within the Indian economy. And that in turn also threatens the stability of a state like India. India has long had problems with insurgencies in Kashmir in particular, where it governs over a Muslim majority that sees Indian rule over Kashmir as illegitimate. But in more recent decades, they've seen the rise of the Naxalite rebellions in most other regions of India. The Naxalites, also often referred to as Maoists, essentially rural farmers, small-scale farmers, that are reacting to their perceived decline in terms of their economic prospects, in large part because of the entry of large mining firms and industrial enterprises taking control over land that was previously accessible to them. Again, that can undermine a state like India. India is not on the verge of collapse, but is certainly starting to show some signs of strain. The same thing is true to a large extent of China. China likewise has problems with income inequality more generally, and in particular in the context of China, also regional inequality, meaning that the areas along the along the shores of the South China Sea have become very wealthy as a result of their rapid industrialization, whereas those countries, those regions in the western regions of China are still very much poor, and that in particular affects also the regions over which China has less control, meaning Tibet and Xinjiang, Xinjiang being a majority Muslim population. Again, that could threaten to destabilize China. There have been some counterexamples. In other words, there has been some diminishing inequality in some regions of the world, in particular in Latin America, since the end of the 1990s. And most prominently in that regard, in Argentina, Venezuela, and Brazil. But what we're seeing in all of those countries is a rather strong counter-reaction to the more nationalist policies and the more socialist policies of their governments. One of which has been defeated outright in elections in Argentina last month. A more right-wing conservative government took power and pushed the Kirchner government out of power, and is instituting essentially very conservative austerity types of policies and trying to reverse many of the policies that were instituted by his predecessor. In Venezuela, which has probably made the greatest strides in terms of dealing with inequality. It was in 1998 judged to be the most inegalitarian country in Latin America, and by the time of Hugo Chavez's death in 2013, had become the most egalitarian country in the Western Hemisphere. And that's one of the reasons why Hugo Chavez is regularly lambasted in the international media, in large part not because of his failure, but because of his success. And that success challenged the privileges of the elites in Venezuela and their international allies on Wall Street and elsewhere. And for that reason, whenever you see him referred to anywhere in the media, try to pay attention to when you see references to Hugo Chavez. He's almost always described as the dictator of Venezuela, despite the fact that he won every single election that he ran in by a very wide margin, and was in that sense by no means a dictator. And he also ruled in accordance to the Venezuelan constitution, to the letter, and in that regard, once again, is not a dictator. But basically, the international impression that's been created is that he is very much a dictator. And that's in large part because he challenged the elites in his own country, and also to a large extent challenged the policies of the empire. He was the person that went to the UN in 2001 and denounced the war on terror as trying to fight terror with terror, which apparently pissed off George W. Bush and resulted in George W. Bush attempting to overthrow his government in 2002. And in 2003, in his UN speech, he referred to George W. Bush, who had been on the podium giving his speech to the UN the day before, as having polluted the air around the podium, making it smell like sulfur. In other words, calling George W. Bush the devil for his expansionist policies. Again, all of that did not endear him to the international community dominated by the United States. He's of course passed away, but the United States has had a policy of destabilization toward Venezuela since his rise to power, and continues to have that basic policy. And that basic policy has also been applied to Brazil, and we're seeing that in the current crisis in Brazil, in which the current government of Dilma Rousseff is being subjected to impeachment procedures on the basis of accusations of corruption. There no doubt is some corruption in the Brazilian government, but Dilma Rousseff's government, from most of those sources, the domestic sources that I've read from Brazil, is not among the more prominent leaders in terms of her corruption. Indeed, she has not personally been accused of corruption, but some of those around her have. As the government itself claims, this is an orchestrated attempt, essentially by the elites in Brazil, to reassert their control and to oppose more austerity programs on the population. Let me leave globalization at that and very quickly conclude by looking at global governance. One of the things that I've tried to emphasize in our discussions over the last couple of months is the need for more capacity toward global governance. In other words, what I've tried to demonstrate is that a number of the problems that we face currently, both in the realm of economics, in the realm of human rights, and in particular in the realm of the environment, require that we depart from the Westphalian state system and create a system that facilitates greater cooperation between states. In other words, global governance. And this is in particular the case with regard to the environmental challenges that we face globally, and that require global answers, and that require that the global community is able to impose those global solutions, even on reluctant states. And that, of course, violates sovereignty. The cornerstone of the Westphalian state system is the issue of sovereignty, that it is ultimately up to each state to decide its own policies, and for each state to be free from the interference in their domestic affairs by other states in the international system. Well, that essentially is not going to get us out of the current situation of, in particular, dealing with things like climate change, pollution, the destruction of habitats, and so on and so forth. Increasingly, it's no longer simply the business of Indonesia, whether it burns down its rainforests or doesn't. When it burns down its rainforests, it, by doing so, increases carbon concentrations in the atmosphere and diminishes biodiversity on the planet, and thus makes us all more vulnerable. And thus, the international community can no longer tolerate the claims of absolute sovereignty by states like Indonesia that fail to take action to protect their environmental assets. And Indonesia, I don't mean to pick on Indonesia, although it is one of the more prominent problems, is by no means the only place where we're losing rainforest rapidly. The same thing is true in large parts of Africa, in particular the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's also true in places like Brazil, that is still burning down large tracts of its rainforest. Global governance is increasingly a requirement. But how realistic is the prospect of global governance? Well, realists, essentially, as we pointed out, and as you guys discussed on your midterm, are rather pessimistic. They argue that it might be necessary, but that doesn't mean it's going to come about. States have never voluntarily surrendered their sovereignty to a greater power. Nowhere in history is there an example of a state voluntarily surrendering their sovereignty to a larger entity, let alone a world government. Liberals tend to be a little bit more optimistic, and historically they've pointed to the European Union as a good example of how the emergence of multinational systems of governance can take place. Europe, from that point of view, seemed like an unlikely place for a pan-European government to arise, given that Europe had been racked by wars in the previous century, and the two major protagonists of the emergence of the European Union, France and Germany, had fought no less than 3 wars against each other in the previous century. But nonetheless, starting with the trade arrangements with regard to coal and steel, and expanding from that into the European Economic Community, and then into the European Union, and then into the European Monetary Union. More and more coordination in terms of economic activities took place within Europe, and along with those trade ties, it also emerged various governmental institutions to govern the territory as a whole. And in that regard, Europe was seen as a model for what could happen globally. And indeed, up until very recently, the ever closer union of European states was generally seen by most observers as a foregone conclusion. In other words, no one anticipated that these gains could be at some point reversed. And consequently, no provisions were made within the European Union's constitution for how such a devolution of power back to the separate states could take place, in particular how countries could leave the monetary union. And that is a major problem today. However, while the European Union was a model for what could take place globally in terms of expanding governance, global governance, it's no longer a very convincing example. It's no longer a very convincing example, A, because the European Union seems to be failing in dealing with its core function, that of maintaining a stable economy, as evidenced by the debt crisis that the European Union finds itself in, that has seen it come close to breaking apart, especially over the issue of Greece. And it's also a less encouraging model in that the long ambition that Europe start to speak with a single voice in international affairs. In other words, have a unified foreign policy and a unified military posture have also not surfaced. And that, again, was illustrated first and foremost in the fiasco around Yugoslavia, in which the European Union was incapable of formulating any kind of policy to deal with it, and ultimately relied on NATO to take action. But it is even more noticeable in the current refugee crisis. If ever there was a reason for the European Union to create a unified policy with regard to the entry of refugees and things along those lines, it is in the current context. But it was incapable of doing so, with Germany being relatively open to the flow of refugees into its territory, and most other countries in Europe are rejecting accepting more refugees. And the most important component of that is that given these different territories, essentially the flood of migrants into Europe became rather ad hoc. In other words, the European Union could not form a single policy and a means by which they could accept whatever refugees they were willing to accept, and instead allowed people smugglers essentially to answer that question for them by smuggling people across the water from Turkey and from Libya into Italy. And that, in that sense, is a clear indication of the inability of Europe to settle its own affairs. Other aspects of global governance are also looking somewhat less convincing. In particular, the role of the UN and the role of the financial institutions like the IMF. Basically, there is increasing conflict over them. The UN and its most important institution, the Security Council, has not been reformed in a meaningful way since it was first founded in 1945. And the most important component of that is the creation of 5 permanent members of the Security Council, each of which have veto power. And at the time that it was established, that arrangement was meant to reflect the balance of power in the international system. Essentially, the 5 permanent members were the 5 victorious powers in the Second World War, and the 5 greatest military powers at the end of the Second World War. And as such, that division of powers reflected the balance of power on the globe more generally. Is that still the case today? Well, quite clearly not. While the position or the seat of China on the Security Council is certainly still justified, as is that of Russia, as is that of the United States. Each of those are enormously important powers. Russia less in economic terms, but certainly in military terms, in terms of its sheer size. China, both because of its military importance and its economic importance, the United States clearly as the hegemonic power. The other two seats are more problematic. Does France still deserve to be on a permanent seat on the Security Council? Does Great Britain? Well, that's questionable at best. But try suggesting getting them off their permanent seats in the Security Council, and you will very quickly get nowhere. In other words, France and Great Britain are going to defend that position at all costs. There are far more deserving candidates in that regard. Certainly India has long maintained that it is more deserving. It has a population of well over 1 billion and has a larger economy than either France or Britain. But it does not have a permanent seat on the Security Council. Brazil could make a similar kind of a case in regard to this. And certainly, so could the second largest, or rather at this point, I think China surpassed it as the second largest economy on the planet a couple of years ago. But the third largest economy on the planet, anyone know which one that is? Japan. Japan does not have a seat on the Security Council. And the fourth largest economy on the planet is Germany. And it does not have a seat on the Security Council. And again, in that regard, the UN does not reflect current realities. And to the extent that it does not reflect current realities, it is likely to be resented by those that are excluded from it. And that resentment, in turn, diminishes the legitimacy of the United Nations more generally, and therefore weakens it in its ability to settle disputes and things along those lines. The same thing is true of the major financial institutions, in particular the IMF. Again, in regard to the basic voting rights within those institutions, those were determined back in 1945 and reflected the power balance at that time. And they've never been seriously readjusted since. And that leaves countries like China and India on the outside. And the natural response to that, as we already discussed, is that they start to try to counterbalance against it by creating competing institutions and so on. And competing institutions are not a step toward global governance. They are a step toward greater global competition and more likely to lead to conflict in that regard. So that's not, on the whole, a very rosy picture. I wish I could leave you with a more cheerful picture of the international community, but that's not our job here. Our job is to see things as clearly as possible and with as few prejudices as possible. And I hope that you found all of this useful. I hope some of you have been inspired by this to take other courses in political science, and I hope to see you in future classes in regard to that. For those of you that are not likely to go on, I nonetheless congratulate you for taking this course and taking this opportunity to do something that the vast majority of your fellow citizens have neither the inclination nor the opportunity ever to do. And that is to look at the big picture, to look at the big forces that shape our world and therefore your livelihoods. And hopefully I've provided you with some tools to think about it more critically in the future that will be useful even if you don't go on to study political science. So thank you for your attention, and at this point, let me see if there's any questions or any points that you would like me to clarify in a bit more detail. Yes?
I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but there are some international organizations, I think, ADACON or something, that basically try to proliferate nuclear energy throughout the world.
I think you're referring to the Pakistani scientist that was the I'm not exactly sure what organization you're referring to. One organization that's very important in that regard is the International Atomic Energy Organization. And the International Atomic Energy Organization was an outgrowth of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And part and parcel of what was established by the United States under the Eisenhower administration, which was called Atoms for Peace. Meaning that the International Atomic Energy Agency is, on the one hand, expected to monitor nuclear developments and to monitor the conformity of countries that are developing nuclear technologies to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But its other function is to promote nuclear energy globally as a source of energy. And in that regard, it has kind of played a dual function of, on the one hand, regulating and on the other hand, promoting. And the one place where we can see that most clearly is in regard to well, the nuclear disaster in Fukushima in Japan, which the Japanese government is trying to downplay as best as possible for understandable reasons. The Japanese are hosting the Olympic Games in 2020 and want to create the impression that their environment is safe, that the problem has been dealt with. But for those of you not familiar with the situation in Fukushima, it has been anything but dealt with. Basically what occurred in Fukushima was 3 meltdowns. In other words, 3 actual reactors melted down, which meant that the core, the fuel in the core, melted through the containment and is not locatable. In other words, they don't know whether it's still sitting at the bottom of that containment vessel or whether it's melted through into the ground and into groundwater. And it's uncontrollable in the sense that they can't even get robots close enough to figure out where that core is. And in order to keep it from exploding, they have to keep pouring more and more water onto it, which then becomes radioactive and is either drained off into the Pacific or stored in enormous pools, which they don't know what to do with either, because it's likely to remain radioactive for decades, if not centuries. In other words, that problem has been anything but contained. And for the most part, in the international media, in large part because of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which promotes nuclear power, basically the impression that you would get if you haven't been following that story very closely is that Japan has dealt with this, that nuclear radiation that has resulted from that accident is no longer a problem if it ever was. Indeed, the BBC just last week, at the 4th anniversary, I think it was the 5th anniversary actually, of the accident, had a brief program where scientists walked through and said, well, you know, this is all perfectly safe. Yeah, there's still radiation, but the radiation won't hurt anyone. It's no problem whatsoever. The exposure that you're likely to get from spending a year living there is less than you would get from a couple of chest x-rays, and it's all perfectly safe. The one thing that she completely ignored, and that any knowledgeable nuclear scientist should distinguish between, is radiation exposure, such as in a chest X-ray, and inhaling radioactive materials, which is what is likely to happen if you spend time in a contaminated area. And while radiation exposure is not particularly dangerous, ingesting radioactive materials, either by breathing them in or by consuming them in drinking water and so on, is enormously dangerous. Again, the Atomic Energy Agency, in that regard, has been doing its best to whitewash nuclear power as a safe alternative to fossil fuels and so on, rather than trying to draw attention to the inherent problems with nuclear power. I don't know whether that answers your question, but probably best I can do.
So they don't
Pardon me?
monitor the effects that because Japan is doing it out of its own form of self-interest. So
Well, the first thing that the Japanese government did is that immediately after the accident, it raised what they considered to be safe exposure rates by 20-fold. In that regard, again, declared safe what they previously themselves considered unsafe. Then they passed a gag rule that made it illegal for any government official to talk about Fukushima or to contradict the official line. In other words, they put a gag on the press in terms of investigating or publishing critical reports on Fukushima. And for the most part, given the interest in promoting nuclear energy, the Atomic Energy Agency has not countered those attempts by the Japanese government. Now, Japan has an enormous stake in nuclear energy. Japan has no other energy sources, no coal deposits, no oil deposits, and therefore relies probably more than any other country, with the possible exception of France, on nuclear power for its energy sources. Consequently, shutting all those nuclear power plants down, as they did in the immediate aftermath of Fukushima, was an enormous problem for Japanese industry and so on. They have every interest in that regard in returning back to normal and ignoring whatever problems remain in Fukushima. But that's another question. I'd be happy to discuss it with you after class, but probably not all that relevant to the class itself. Any other questions more directly related to some of the issues that we've discussed in class today or over the last several months? Yes?
The Siamese twin analogy for China and America,
Yeah?
would that be more of a liberal analysis on the situation?
I would say so. Essentially, what that analysis points to is codependency or interdependency or complex interdependencies, the way that Joseph Nye describes it. In other words, that the two countries currently, the idea of Siamese twins attached at the wallet refers more specifically to that China has developed a major trade surplus with regard to the United States, which has allowed it to pile up huge numbers of dollar reserves, estimated to be around 1.7 trillion in U.S. reserves. And many, in particular those more skeptical of American stability, have argued that this possession of such a huge reserve of US dollars gives the Chinese the possibility of overnight destroying the American economy. In other words, all that the Chinese would have to do to destroy the American dollar is to dump all those dollars on the international markets overnight, which would plummet the value of the US dollar and sink the American economy. Why don't the Chinese do that? Well, one reason why they don't do that is because the first people to be hurt by that would be China themselves. That $1.7 trillion would no longer be worth what it was the day before. And therefore China has no interest in doing that. It has every bit of, has a considerable interest in maintaining a high value of the US dollar, given that they hold so many US dollars. And in that regard, China and the US are codependent on each other. The United States needs China to continue to fund its trade deficits, and China needs the United States as a market and to maintain the value of their currency assets. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Now, for the most part, one of the things that realists invariably argue is that politics trumps economics, and strategy trumps politics. In other words, that whatever codependency there exists between China and the United States is irrelevant when it comes to considerations of long-term grand strategy. And that grand strategy refers to maintaining the United States as a unipolar dominant force. And therefore, they would argue that the United States is going to do what is necessary in order to downgrade China, even if it hurts their economic prospects. Liberals tend not to see it that way. And again, one way of looking at that is, at the beginning of our class, we talked about understandings of the state. For the most part, realists argue that states are independent variables. In other words, that they embody within themselves a logic of security and so on that is not reducible to the preferences of voters or the preferences of ruling economic elites. And in that regard, essentially, realists consistently argue that states focus first and foremost on security and on their grand strategies to maintain their security. And whatever concerns about economic well-being and so on are secondary to those considerations. Liberals and Marxists tend to see states as dependent variables. In other words, states reflect the interests either of dominant economic elites in the case of Marxists or of whoever wins elections in the case of liberals. And that means that as the preferences either of the dominant elites or of the population change, so do the actions of governments. Which of these you find most convincing is ultimately up to you to decide. But if the liberals are correct, that governments reflect the preferences of their voters, of those that win elections, whatever coalition that is, and if the interests of that coalition are in greater integration with China, and greater interdependency and so on and so forth, then eventually that codependency will eclipse whatever security concerns these countries have with regard to each other and lead to a more stable environment. Again, it depends on which perspective you take on this. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Any other quick questions? Yeah.
Yeah, in the interest of avoiding conflict with Russia and China, should the U.S. assume a friendlier and more inclusive attitude towards these countries?
Toward Russia or China?
Yeah.
In order to split them apart from each other?
No, like so that relations between them and US are less
Well, currently, all the evidence is in the other direction. Currently, there is a unprecedented military buildup, NATO buildup in Eastern Europe that is essentially designed to constrain Russian ambitions in Eastern Europe, which I think are doubtful, but for reasons that I discussed before. But quite clearly, if the United States and the United States military declares Russia an aggressor and acts towards Russia as an aggressor by stationing more and more military capacities on its borders, it's only a matter of time until Russia will act accordingly. In other words, until that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The same thing is to a large extent true with regard to China. This morning's New York Times, if you go look on your computer, you'll see that one of the biggest stories is about the confrontation between the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy in the South China Sea, and a particular conflict, well, not even really a conflict, but a confrontation around the Spratly Islands between a Chinese frigate and an American warship patrolling through the South China Sea. Again, that the United States has shifted 2/3 of its Navy capacities, or its naval capacities, to the South China Sea and the Western Pacific. And that begs the question, well, who's the enemy in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea? And the obvious answer is China. And if the United States perceives China as an enemy, it's only a matter of time until the Chinese will act accordingly. In other words, until that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's problematic, certainly. Does that kind of answer your question?
Is it in U.S. interest to?
Is this in the U.S.'s interest to do so? That depends on that depends on how you define national interest. And certainly, I mean, one of the things that makes that very apparent is, for example, if you look at Germany. Germany finds itself currently in a very peculiar position. The United States and Great Britain in particular, along with the Canadian government, are seeing Russia as a major threat to global stability, as expansionist, and are trying to impose sanctions on Russia to prevent it from expanding further into Eastern Europe, and so on and so forth. Germany, on the other hand, has enormous trade ties to Russia. Its close neighbor has an extensive need for German industrial goods and so on in order to develop its economy, especially its energy economy and so on. And that means that imposing sanctions goes very much against the economic interests of German elites, of German industry. But basically, as a NATO partner, the United States and the other partners in NATO have been able to force Germany to go along with that policy. And that seems to suggest the realist interpretation. In other words, that security invariably trumps economic interest. But it's not easy in the context of Germany itself. In other words, it created a major rift in the ruling alliance of the Christian Democrats in Germany under Angela Merkel. The Christian Democrats are, for the most part, the pro-industry conservative party of the establishment. And large numbers of their supporters are these industrial groups that have every interest in easy access to the Russian market, and by extension, easy access to the Chinese market. The Chinese market is more important to Europe than the American market, and the European market, in turn, is more important to the Chinese than the American market. And consequently, the strategy of China and Russia is what is now called the New Silk Road Project. The New Silk Road Project is essentially a project by China to build extensive rail links from Shanghai to Berlin, or from Shanghai to Lisbon, they're saying, essentially to integrate all of the Eurasian continent as a single economic bloc. Well, if they were successful at doing that, the United States would to a large extent become irrelevant in the international system. The vast majority of the population is on the Eurasian continent, most trade takes place on the Eurasian continent, and everyone on the Eurasian continent would gain from that. The United States has every interest, therefore, in preventing that. And I would suggest that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, on the one hand, is a means of encircling China from one side, and that the growing tensions between Russia and Europe over Ukraine and things along those lines are a means of cutting Europe off from Russia, and therefore from China, and therefore undermining that overall project. So I don't know whether that answers your question, and I'm not sure I can do a better job than that. But what it does seem to suggest is the nature of the kinds of conflicts that we're going to see moving forward. You had another question.
What are the most important things you say we should look at for the exam?
I don't want to give you a hint in that regard, in large part because, well, a lot of people have already left the class, and I can't give you guys a leg up as much as you're the more diligent students that stuck around. But basically, I think that it's always a mistake to try to guess what kind of questions are going to be on the exam. The best thing that you can do is sort of, in the most general terms, prepare yourself. And by that, I don't mean that you try to memorize everything in the textbook. Memorization is never a very good way of retaining material, but rather to deal with some of the core questions that we've been discussing in class and in your tutorials, and to try to gauge your, one way of studying for this is that if you ask yourself, well, what kind of question would I ask if I were to try to gauge people's understanding? Chances are you come up with very similar questions to the ones that you're likely to see on the final exam. And basically, a good way of studying for exams is that review your notes, and at the end of the notes, ask yourself, well, could I summarize what was covered here in 10 minutes or less? And if you feel comfortable being able to summarize our discussion of human rights, our discussion of the environment, our discussion of terrorism and so on, then chances are you're in pretty good shape. Memorization is never a good way of going about that. And the same thing is true with regard to the chapters or the assigned readings. Basically, the final exam is going to be a 2-hour opportunity for you to summarize what you've learned over the last several months. And that means that you can't go into huge amounts of detail, that you should focus mostly on the big picture, on the key questions, and the key theories to answer those questions, and then fill in details insofar as they're useful to illustrate your answers. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Are you leaning more towards the textbook or the lecture?
The textbook and the lectures are meant to complement each other, not to duplicate each other. And if you've been following both at the same time, you'll probably notice that I've gone into more detail on some things than the textbook does. And in most cases, the textbook goes into much more detail, in large part because we don't have enough time to cover things in as much detail as the textbook does. So in that sense, they're meant to complement each other. And I certainly hope that you found my lectures useful in that regard. But it's not going to be there's not going to be a greater emphasis on lectures or on the textbooks. I think that they're complementary. Okay, if there's no other questions, then thank you all for your attention, and I hope you got some value out of this class, and I hope to see some of you in future classes, and I will certainly see you at the final exam. So thanks for your attention, and on this occasion I managed to let you out a little bit early, so finally I've made good fun of it.